For those who don't know Ashleigh, she's graduated in 2012 from Kincumber High School, and in that year she won the Sydney Morning Herald Young Writer of the Year Award for her story A Kiss Before Dying, set in World War One. In that same year, Ashleigh got a grant from the Bouddi Foundation to start her degree at Wollongong, and she did a BA in Creative Arts at Wollongong. And in 2016 and 21, Ashleigh got further grants from the Bouddi Foundation, and her work has appeared in Spectrum, Furious Fiction, Outlook Spring. One. Okay. It just keeps coming loose. The Melaleuca Blue, Needle in the Hay, Tales from the Pandemic, and Grieve, Volume 9, Australians' Best Yarns. So, we've only got 15 minutes, so we don't want to waste too much more on biography for such a young person. One book that we want to talk about, or a story, is a book or a story, Blair Moon. We're talking about it's a children's book, isn't it?
It's a children's novel, yeah.
You want to use your microphone?
Oh, it's a children's novel.
Use that. Okay. A children's novel, Blair Moon, Too Cool for School, and it's about an 11-year-old girl growing up in a nursing home. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Just tell us a little bit about that. That's a very challenging subject or a setting for a story. What prompted that? And tell us about when we're able to start purchasing the book.
I think it was actually inspired by my grandparents and just this idea that if a child grew up just with the reinforcement of the grandparents without ever being grounded by a schoolyard, they might have very lofty aspirations and nothing could stop them. So it's a young girl who wants to be president of the world. She's never heard of being cool. She's very good at bingo. She's very good at bocce. She knows a lot about hip replacements, but she doesn't know a lot about schoolyard politics. So that's kind of the launching pad, and then that created this very ambitious, very motivated character who just sort of went off and did her own thing. The book, I think at this stage, is coming out somewhere between June and August. We've yet to get a firm date.
Okay. So when you say it's a children's novel, what age range are we talking about? And would this audience here be able to enjoy it? Would they be able to relate to it?
I think so. That was kind of my idea, is I wanted to, also remembering my dad complaining about reading particular children's books that weren't enjoyable for adults. I wanted to write one that would be enjoyable for the adults reading it with the kids as well. So there's jokes in there, and this is one of the reasons I had trouble finding a home for it, because I kept getting this feedback that there are jokes in there that aren't for kids. I'm like, not every joke is for kids. Some of them are for the people who are sitting there reading it with them to go, that's funny. But yeah, I think it was something that I aimed for adults to enjoy as well.
Okay, so look out for that. Blair Moon, Too Cool for School, hopefully in the shops by July, shall we say? June. Even better.
I'm wishing into existence.
Right. Tell me also about, then you took one of the grants from the Bouddi Foundation to go to University of Maine, a year exchange. What was that like? What was the course you were doing in Maine, and what did you get out of that in that year?
So I went to the University of Miami for a semester on exchange, and I did a few different courses. I was in my third year of creative writing degree by that stage. So I did Introduction to Poetry, which I was really good at, because it was Introduction to Poetry, and I was in my third year. But then I also accidentally took, there's all these people saying, oh, does anyone know what a metaphor is? I'm like, I know. But I also accidentally took a graduate course in screenwriting, and I'd never done any kind of screenwriting. So that was really challenging. It took me a while to figure out I was in the wrong class. But they wanted us to write an entire feature film in 6 months, and someone had to pull me up and tell me to stop writing it in a Word document, because that's not how you write screenplays. But that kind of opened me up to screenwriting. I ended up going to AFTRS following that, because I loved it so much. And a producer who was in the course actually ended up making the film in Miami the following year. So that's like a feature film that I have, because I didn't understand American course codes, and I ended up in that class by accident.
Okay. The movie is called Questions and Comments. Just tell us briefly what it's about and how you chose that the storyline.
I feel like I'm just going to keep saying my family members inspired things, but my dad is always, he's got a lot of concerns about how things are run, and he is always threatening to write letters, and I thought, he never writes the letters, but I thought, what would someone's life look like if they did write all these letters? And the film sort of opens with someone who's writing a letter to McCain's to complain about the quality of frozen peas, and that the letter is entitled The Frozen Peas of Disappointment, and it's just the worst thing that's ever happened to them. So it was kind of based around this guy who just sees faults with everything, and ultimately one of the companies that he complains about sees a fault with him and sues him back.
I see. What's the running time of the movie?
I'm actually not sure. I think it's about 90 minutes.
9 minutes?
90.
Oh, 90 minutes, right, okay. And it got released, and it's had some success in festivals around the world, hasn't it, since it was shown?
Yeah, the producer was very prolific in submitting it. So we're in some film festivals in America, in South Africa, it's a bit random, some in Europe and some in Australia.
Mm-hmm. And does that inspire you to do more screenwriting, or do you find that was once was enough?
I think I have sort of gone back to novel writing, which I think, looking back, I think I was always going to end up back on novel writing. And I also love that a novel is a finished product as well. When you write a novel, it's done, and you don't need to consider budget. You don't need to think about how are they going to shoot this. You can just do whatever you want. Whereas a screenplay is essentially just a set of directions. And if you can't find someone to follow those directions, then you've just got a half-finished thing sitting on your computer. And I found that a bit frustrating.
Yeah. You must have to compromise quite a lot with a screenplay in terms of what the producers and director wants, what particular actors want from it. There's a lot of people to satisfy, aren't there? With a novel, it's yours and it's out there and that's it.
Yeah, and there's no limit on how many settings you can have, how many characters you can introduce.
Right.
You can sort of just go off on a tangent if you want to.
Yeah, great. Tell us about Tales from the Pandemic. Did you have a tough time during the COVID? What were you doing in that period? Not that it's over, by the way, it's just a little lapse, but you had that couple of years of lockdown. Were you in the lockdown?
Yeah,
here in
New South Wales.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the story that was published in that book, I wrote during the long lockdown. I wouldn't say I had a harder time than anybody else, but obviously it was a very prolonged period of isolation and huge change, and I think I came out of it on the other side just a completely different person, which is a lot of change to happen in a couple of years from outside influences.
Are you talking about yourself or about the characters in the stories you were writing?
Both, I'd say, yeah.
You came out a different person, the other end of it?
I would say so, yeah. And I was still writing a lot of children's and young adult before the pandemic, and I basically only write adult novels now.
Mm. So what was that trigger? What makes you think you were so different? Was it time to think, time to reconsider life, or what was it that made that huge difference over that 2 years that changed you so much?
Just probably a period of loss, like a lot of people had, but also maybe growing up that would have happened anyway. I sort of started, I think I was in my early 20s in the beginning of the pandemic, and I was still floating around. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And sort of 2 years later, I was married, I had a house, I had a full-time job. It was just a very steep escalation of adulthood.
Sure. One would think in one way that being in isolation for that period would be quite comfortable for a writer. You've got no distractions, there's nothing else you can do. All you can do is sit down and think and write. But did you find that was as easy as that, or was it a time of depression and anxiety?
I think it probably would have depended what I was writing. If I'd been writing something like Blair Moon, which is really funny and joyous, and came really easily, I think I wrote that book in a month, and I couldn't wait to write it. But I was in the middle of this book that I'd vastly overestimated myself on, and it was going horribly wrong at the same time. So maybe I shouldn't blame the pandemic. Maybe I should blame that book. Just tell you're obviously very committed to writing still, even after that experience. What is it you think that drives you to write?
But what is the compulsion? And what do you want to write about? Do you have big stories you want to tell? Do you know what they are yet? Or are they discoveries you make, along the track? How does it work for you as a writer?
I think a lot of the time I write to figure out what I'm trying to say. I think I don't know until I'm halfway through it and I'm looking at it. But I don't know if it was ever really a decision I made to write. It was something I was doing from a really young age. Even before I could write, I was doing journals full of pre-writing, the scribble. And I'd say, this is a story, this is a poem. And my mum would say, could you read it to me? Because I don't know what that is.
Right, okay.
But yeah, I'm not sure it's something that I ever decided to do. It was just something I did.
But now you can't stop. You have to write now. There is something driving you now.
Yeah. But I think I have a friend who's a writer, and we spoke about this recently. The idea of did you ever actually come close to giving up? And we both said, oh yeah, I thought I'd give up. And then we said, but would you still write? And well, you'd still have ideas. So of course, you'd still write them down. And then we'd be like, but would you submit them? And we're like, well, if you've already written them, you might as well submit them. And then we're like, so no, we're never really close to giving up.
That's right. I remember asking David Malouf, do you never ever know how a story will end? And he said, well, if I knew that, I wouldn't have to write the story. So it's a rather similar situation, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. I tend to know how a story's going to end. I think I have to, otherwise I really go on a tangent. But it's incredible how you can know how a story's starting and how a story's going to end, and the changes that still happen on the way to what you thought was going to happen.
Because characters take over the story from you, or?
Yeah, and they develop relationships with different people that you didn't expect them to, and different things that you thought were going to work don't work. You think, a particular relationship might develop over several chapters, but then it ended up being a paragraph, and then they moved on.
Right.
It's actually surprisingly hard to control, considering they came from your brain.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Amazing. I don't know how we're doing for time. Is someone going to ring the bell on me when we're up? But have we? Oh, good. To writers of your generation now, how are you coping with the pushback, woke, cancel culture? You can't tell that story. It's not your story to tell. How do you feel about that, and how do you handle it? Do you think there are stories that you want to tell but you aren't allowed to?
I wouldn't say it's affected me massively. I think when I was younger, I really argued against write what you know. I think write whatever you want. But now that I'm older, even though it goes off in its own direction, it does normally come from where I am. So when I was younger, I was writing children's books and I was writing young adult, and now I'm writing adult books, and they're normally people who look like me and come from a similar background, even if they make very different choices and they behave in a really different way. But I feel like that sort of grounds it in reality a little bit, to write characters that come from a similar background.
But in principle, do you think writers should be allowed to write any story they want, from any viewpoint they want, from any voice they want to use?
I think it depends. I think it would just ultimately be inauthentic for me to write about a character who experienced hardships that I have no understanding of, or who experienced racism or oppression. I mean, those are things that I'm not really going to be able to speak well about, and that there are artists of colour who are going to be able to speak on it better. So I think it's more about making a space, because those stories should be told, but I just don't necessarily think I'm the person to tell those specific stories.
Okay, good. I think we're almost out of time. Did anybody have any questions they wanted to throw to Ashleigh? Yes. Yeah.
I'm wondering how you both feel about this controversy at the moment about changing Roald Dahl's words in books.
Over to you, Ashleigh. What do you think about that?
No, you go.
You're the writer. What do you think about that?
I wouldn't say I'm across it enough. I'm not sure exactly what words were changed. But I think if it's something that allows the works to still be consumed, it depends how much they're being changed as well. If they're just taking like a word or two out, I mean, does it ultimately change the work itself? If it hasn't changed it, but it's just made it a bit more palatable for a new generation, then I don't know if it's something that I specifically take umbrage with. And I grew up reading Roald Dahl, and I love his work. I think anything that gets it into the hands of the next generation, I think is worth doing.
On a lighter note, someone told me that recently Enid Blyton is being cancelled, not so much cancelled, but brought up to date, so that her two heroes called Dick and Fanny are now Rick and Rachel or something. I mean, I can't imagine why. I mean,
See, that's a shame, because I thought that was hilarious when I was a kid.
I think we're up. Will you please thank Ashleigh Mounser very much.